The coldest part of the Neanderthal story is not that they disappeared. It is that no one can point to the exact moment when they were gone. There was no clear ending written into history. For thousands of generations, they endured ice, hunger, injury, and long winters that would have broken many others. Then, over time, the signs of their presence became fewer and fewer, while another kind of human continued to spread across the landscape. And if a trace of them still survives within some of us today, then the question becomes even stranger. Did the Neanderthals truly disappear at all? A disappearance can sound like a clean event, as if a door closed somewhere in the ancient dark, and a whole kind of human stepped through it for the last time. But the Neanderthal story does not come to us that way. It comes in pieces. A bone from one cave, a stone tool from another shelter, a layer of ash, a tooth, a cut mark on animal bone, a date that can be measured, but never held with perfect certainty. When people ask why the last Neanderthals disappeared, the first honest answer is that we do not even know how to picture their final days. We should not imagine one last tribe standing on a cliff, watching the future arrive. We should not imagine a single battle, a single winter, or one simple disaster that erased them from the earth. The deeper truth is quieter. Their presence becomes harder to see. Their traces grow thinner in the ground. The places where they had lived for immense stretches of time begin to show more evidence of another human form, Homo sapiens, moving through the same landscapes. The old world did not announce that it was changing. It simply changed. For many thousands of years before their disappearance, Neanderthals had been real people of Europe and Western Asia. They knew cold valleys, limestone caves, open plains, forests that came and went with the climate, and animals whose movements shaped the rhythm of life. Their bodies were strong, but that does not mean their lives were easy. Fire had to be kept, food had to be found, children had to be protected, injuries had to be survived. The group had to move when the land no longer gave enough. None of this belongs to a myth of failure. It belongs to a long record of endurance. That is why their disappearance is so difficult to reduce to a simple story. A weak people might vanish in the imagination without much explanation, but the Neanderthals were not weak. They had lived through repeated changes in climate, through cold phases and warmer phases, through shifts in plants, animals, and hunting grounds. So when their traces decline, the question becomes more serious. What kind of pressure can slowly overcome a people who had already endured so much? Archaeology gives us clues, but it rarely gives us a final sentence. In one region, Neanderthal remains may seem to end earlier. In another, certain tools or bones may suggest that they remained longer. Some evidence is debated, some dates are revised, some sites that once looked late may become less certain after better testing. This does not mean the science is unreliable. It means the past is difficult, and honest science moves carefully through difficulty. The last Neanderthals did not leave behind a written account saying why their children became fewer, why their camps were abandoned, or how they understood the arrival of other humans. We are left with patterns. We see that Neanderthals were present for a very long time. We see that Homo sapiens spread into parts of Eurasia where Neanderthals had lived. We see that, after a certain period, clearly Neanderthal remains become rare, then absent. But between presence and absence, there is a wide grey space. That grey space is where this story must begin, not with certainty, not with blame, not with a dramatic ending. Their disappearance may have been made of many small losses, one group failing to recover after a harsh season, one family line ending, one valley no longer used, one contact with strangers changing the future in ways no one could see. For the people living through it, there may have been no sense of an ending at all. There was only the next fire, the next hunt, the next winter, the next child, the next place to sleep. And somewhere inside that ordinary struggle, something ancient began to fade from the record. This is why the question cannot be answered too quickly. Before asking what killed the Neanderthals, we have to ask what it means for a people to disappear when they leave no final moment behind. The ground does not remember in the way a human mind remembers. It does not keep a complete story. It keeps fragments, and those fragments survive unevenly. A cave that stayed dry may hold a bone for tens of thousands of years. Another place, where people once slept, cooked, repaired tools, and watched the weather change beyond the entrance, may leave almost nothing at all. Soil moves, water seeps through stone, animals disturb layers. Later humans walk over older traces. Time does not preserve the past equally. This matters deeply when we ask why the last Neanderthals disappeared, because the evidence does not show us a clean line between a world with Neanderthals and a world without them. It shows scattered signs, separated by distance, damaged by time, and interpreted with care. In one layer, archaeologists may find tools that seem connected to Neanderthal life. In another, they may find animal bones with marks from cutting or breaking. Somewhere else, there may be a tooth, a skull fragment, a piece of charcoal from an old fire, or a stone flake shaped by a hand that vanished long before any written language existed. Each object speaks, but it speaks softly. It can tell us that someone was there. It may suggest what they ate, how they worked, or what kind of landscape surrounded them, but it cannot easily tell us whether that group was thriving, struggling, leaving, dying, mixing with others, or simply passing through. The disappearance of Neanderthals is therefore not seen as a single silence. It is seen as a thinning pattern. There are fewer places where their presence is clear. There are fewer remains that can be confidently called Neanderthal. There are changing tool traditions, changing dates, and changing interpretations as better methods are used. This is not a weakness in the story. It is the nature of studying deep time. When a date is measured from an ancient bone or a layer of charcoal, it comes with a range, not a perfect point. When a tool is found, it may belong to a tradition associated with a certain human group, but tools alone do not always identify the maker with certainty. A stone blade does not carry a name. A hearth does not say who sat beside it. A cave wall does not tell us whether the people who left traces there returned the next season or never came back. So the last Neanderthals remain difficult to locate, not because they were unreal, but because they lived in a world that left incomplete marks behind. This is why we must be careful with the word last. It gives the mind a simple image, the final family, the final fire, the final child, the final voice. But the archaeological record rarely allows that kind of certainty. The last Neanderthals may have been many small groups, spread across different landscapes, living at different times near the end of their history. Some may have survived longer in one region than another. Some may have met Homo sapiens. Some may have never seen them directly, but still felt the consequences of a changing world. Some may have lived in places where nothing of them was preserved. When their traces fade, we are not watching one camp go dark. We are watching a map lose light slowly, unevenly, and with many blank spaces between them. That is why the question at the center of this story must remain open at the beginning. If we rush to say they were killed, or outsmarted, or frozen out, or absorbed, we may turn a complex disappearance into a simple tale. The ground asks us to move more slowly. It shows presence, then uncertainty, then absence. It shows that Neanderthals were once deeply rooted in their world, and then, across generations, became harder to find. Somewhere between the last clear bone and the first empty layer, something happened, but the earth does not give us the whole sentence. It gives us only the spaces where a sentence used to be. To understand why the last Neanderthals disappeared, we have to resist the comfort of a single answer. A single answer is easy to remember. It gives the mind something firm to hold. Climate changed, so they vanished. Homo sapiens arrived, so they vanished. Their numbers were small, so they vanished. They mixed with other humans, so they vanished. Each of these ideas may hold part of the truth, but none of them is strong enough by itself to carry the whole weight of the story. The Neanderthal disappearance sits at the meeting point of several pressures, all moving slowly, all touching one another. A cold period could make food harder to find. A small population could make recovery from hunger or illness more difficult. The arrival of Homo sapiens could increase competition for animals, shelter, and useful stone. Wider social networks among modern humans may have helped them survive bad seasons more effectively. Interbreeding could mean that some Neanderthal lineages did not end in a simple biological sense, but became folded into other human populations. None of this gives us a clean ending. It gives us a living system under strain. That is the proper beginning for this video. Neanderthals were not a puzzle piece removed from the world in one motion. They were part of a changing landscape, and the landscape itself was never still. The ice sheets grew and withdrew, forests shifted, open grasslands expanded and shrank. Herd animals moved according to seasons and climate. A valley that once offered good hunting might later offer less. A shelter that once stood near reliable resources might become less useful when animal routes changed. For a small human group, these changes were not abstract. They meant longer walks, riskier hunts, more hunger, fewer chances to meet other groups, and perhaps fewer children surviving into adulthood. When we ask why Neanderthals disappeared, we are really asking how many pressures a population can absorb before its future becomes too thin to continue. This is different from asking whether they were strong or weak. Strength can help a body endure one winter. Skill can help a hunter bring down an animal. Knowledge can help a group find shelter, make fire, and shape stone. But survival across thousands of years depends on more than strength. It depends on numbers, movement, contact, births, deaths, accidents, climate, and the ability of separate groups to remain connected. A people can be capable, intelligent, and deeply adapted to their world, and still become vulnerable if their world changes faster than their population can respond. This is one of the quiet lessons hidden inside the Neanderthal question. Their disappearance does not need to mean they failed in a simple way. It may mean that the conditions that had supported them for so long became less forgiving, while another human population was spreading into the same spaces. The presence of Homo sapiens must be handled carefully here. It is tempting to turn the story into a contest, as if two kinds of humans met and one defeated the other. But the evidence does not require such a dramatic picture. Competition can happen without war. Replacement can happen without a single act of violence. One group may use a landscape more widely, maintain longer distance connections, recover faster after scarcity, or have more opportunities to find mates. Over many generations, small advantages can become large historical changes. At the same time, genetic evidence shows that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were not simply strangers divided by an invisible wall. They met closely enough to leave traces in later human DNA. That fact makes the word disappeared more complicated. If some Neanderthal ancestry survived inside later people, then their ending was not only an extinction, it was also a merging, uneven and partial, with another human story. Still, we must not make that sound too simple either. A genetic trace is not the same as a living Neanderthal community, continuing unchanged. A fragment of ancestry can remain while languages, faces, customs, hunting grounds, and group identities vanish beyond recovery. This is why the next parts of the story must move slowly. We will look first at who the Neanderthals really were, because no disappearance can be understood until we understand what was there before it faded. Then we will follow the pressures around them: climate, population size, contact with Homo sapiens, social connection, and the strange survival of their DNA. Only after that can the central question become clearer. Not answered completely, but clearer. Why did the last Neanderthals disappear? Perhaps because no single force had to destroy them. Perhaps many ordinary pressures, repeated across many generations, were enough to make an ancient human presence grow faint. Before we can understand why the last Neanderthals disappeared, we have to see them clearly. For a long time, they were often imagined as rough, dull, half-human creatures, standing in the shadow of Homo sapiens as if their disappearance had been natural and deserved. That picture is too simple, and it is not fair to the evidence. Neanderthals were not a failed version of us. They were a different kind of human, shaped by a different history, living for a very long time across parts of Europe and Western Asia. Their world was often cold, unstable, and demanding, but they were not helpless inside it. They knew how to survive in landscapes where winter could be long, animals could be dangerous, and food could never be taken for granted. Their bodies carried the marks of that world. They were generally strong, with broad chests, powerful limbs, and a build that may have helped them endure colder climates. Their faces were different from ours, with heavy brow ridges and large noses, but these differences should not be treated like signs of inferiority. They were signs of a separate path of human evolution. If we look at them only through modern human faces, we miss what they actually were. People adapted to a hard environment, not people waiting to be replaced. This matters for the central question, because a group that survived for hundreds of thousands of years cannot be explained away as fragile or foolish. If the Neanderthals disappeared, the reason must be deeper than the old story that they were simply less capable. Their lives required knowledge. They made stone tools. They used fire. They hunted large animals, sometimes in difficult terrain, where a mistake could break bones or end a life. They cut meat, prepared hides, lived in shelters, and moved through seasonal landscapes with the kind of practical memory that no single object in the ground can fully reveal. A stone tool may look silent in a museum case, but in its own time it belonged to a hand, a task, a meal, a wound, a cold evening, or a group trying to continue. Neanderthals also cared for one another in ways that suggest social bonds were important. Some individuals survived injuries or physical limitations that would have been very hard to endure alone. That does not mean we should turn them into modern people wearing ancient faces, or imagine details we cannot prove, but it does mean they lived in groups where survival was shared. They were not just bodies moving through ice. They were social beings, and any explanation for their disappearance must account for the loss of whole communities, not merely the loss of a species' name. Their intelligence should also be approached carefully. We do not need to claim that Neanderthals thought exactly as Homo sapiens did. We do not need to exaggerate their abilities to respect them. The evidence is strong enough without fantasy. They made and used tools. They controlled fire. They adapted to harsh conditions. In some cases, evidence suggests symbolic or unusual behavior, though such findings are often discussed carefully because ancient meaning is hard to prove. The honest point is simpler. Neanderthals were capable humans with deep survival traditions. They were not a cartoon of prehistory. They were a population that had already answered many of the hardest questions nature could ask. How do you stay warm? How do you hunt? How do you raise children in a dangerous world? How do you return to a place when the season changes? How do you keep knowledge alive when there is no writing, only memory, practice, and example? For generation after generation, Neanderthals had answers good enough to keep them here. That is why their disappearance becomes more mysterious, not less. If they had been weak, their ending would be easy to imagine. But they were strong. If they had been ignorant, their ending would seem simple. But they knew their world. If they had lived only briefly, their absence might feel like a small branch cut from the human tree. But they endured for an immense span of time. So the question must be asked with respect. What changed around them, or within their world, that even such long experience could no longer protect them? The strength of Neanderthals was not the strength of a legend. It was the practical strength of bodies that had lived for a very long time in demanding places. Their bones suggest people built for hard movement, close contact with cold, and a life where the body was used every day with intensity. A broad chest, powerful arms, strong legs, and a sturdy frame were not decorations of prehistory. They were part of a way of living. A Neanderthal did not survive by standing apart from the land. A Neanderthal survived by moving through it, reading it, enduring it, and returning again and again to the places where food, stone, shelter, and fire could be found. This physical world matters because the disappearance of the last Neanderthals was not the disappearance of a helpless people. It was the fading of people who had already proven that they could live where life was often difficult. Their hunting was not simple violence against animals. It required planning, courage, knowledge of movement, and probably cooperation inside the group. Many of the animals around them were large and dangerous. Horses, deer, bison, wild cattle, and other Ice Age animals were not easy food. They had to be approached, followed, trapped, ambushed, or driven into places where hunters could take great risks. Close-range hunting may have brought serious injuries. A broken bone, a damaged shoulder, a wound that became infected, or a fall on stone could change a life forever. Yet Neanderthals continued to hunt and live across vast stretches of time. Their tools were part of this survival. Stone flakes, scrapers, points, and other worked pieces were not random stones. They were shaped with intention. They belonged to hands that understood material, which stone would break well, which edge would cut, which tool could clean a hide, divide meat, scrape wood, or prepare something useful for the next day. A tool may look small to us now, but in their world a sharp edge could mean food, warmth, protection, and the repair of daily life. Fire also belonged to that world. Around fire, cold became more bearable. Meat could be cooked. Darkness could be pushed back. A group could gather, repair tools, watch children, and remain in one place long enough to rest. We should be careful not to imagine every Neanderthal night as peaceful, or every cave as a home. Some shelters were temporary. Some places were used again and again. Some traces are only brief marks of passage, but the wider pattern shows a people who knew how to use what their world offered. That knowledge makes their disappearance harder to explain in a shallow way. If a population has tools, fire, hunting skill, social life, and long experience with cold landscapes, then its decline cannot be reduced to a lack of ability. Something more complex must have happened around them. Their clothing and shelter also remind us that survival was not only a matter of muscle. In colder regions, bodies needed covering. Hides had to be prepared. Fires had to be maintained. Wind, snow, and wet ground had to be managed. A group that failed at these ordinary tasks would not last for long. Neanderthals lasted. This endurance does not make them invincible, but it does show that they were well suited to many of the challenges they faced. A people can be well suited to one kind of world and still become vulnerable when several conditions shift at once. That is the quiet tension at the center of the Neanderthal story. Their strength may have helped them for thousands of generations, but strength is not always enough when prey routes change, when groups are small, when contact with another human population changes the balance of land and resources, or when recovery after loss becomes harder. The body can endure hunger for a while. A skilled hunter can survive one dangerous season. A group can rebuild after one death, one failed hunt, or one cold year. But if pressure returns again and again, even capable people may begin to leave fewer descendants behind. So when we look at Neanderthal bodies, tools, fire, and hunting, we are not looking at clues that explain why they were doomed. We are looking at the opposite. We are looking at reasons their disappearance should surprise us. They were not weak shadows before modern humans. They were deeply experienced humans whose world had supported them for a very long time. The real question is not why an incapable people vanished. The real question is why capability itself was no longer enough. If the Neanderthals had vanished quickly after appearing, their story would feel different. It might seem like a brief experiment in human evolution, a form of life that could not hold its place for long. But that is not what happened. Neanderthals endured for an enormous span of time, long enough for landscapes to change again and again around them. They lived through cold phases, warmer intervals, moving herds, shifting forests, open plains, dangerous hunts, and the repeated uncertainty of food. Their existence was not a small spark that went out at the first wind. It was a long fire, tended across generations. That is why their disappearance should not be treated as an easy result of weakness. A people who can survive harsh climates, make tools, use fire, hunt large animals, care for injured members, and raise children in difficult conditions has already answered many survival questions successfully. The deeper mystery is why those answers eventually stopped being enough. When we look at Neanderthals this way, the question changes. We are no longer asking why a crude people failed. We are asking why a capable human population, deeply familiar with its world, began to leave fewer and fewer signs behind. Their knowledge must have been practical, carried in bodies and memory rather than writing. A child did not learn survival from a book. A child watched how stone was struck, how fire was protected, how an animal track was read, how a shelter was chosen, how meat was shared, how danger was noticed before it came too close. This kind of knowledge can last a very long time, but it also depends on living groups large enough and stable enough to pass it on. If groups become too small, too scattered, or too often broken by hardship, knowledge can weaken even when intelligence remains. This is one reason the Neanderthal disappearance cannot be separated from population. Their skills were real, but skills need people to carry them forward. A sharp tool means little if there are too few hands left to make it. A good hunting place means less if the animals move away or if the group no longer has enough hunters to take the same risks. Fire matters, but fire must be fed, guarded, and brought back after it dies. The daily strength of Neanderthals was therefore always tied to the fragile continuity of the group. This is where their long success becomes part of the mystery. They were adapted to demanding conditions, but adaptation is not a promise of permanent survival. It is a relationship with a particular world. If that world changes slowly, a population may adjust. If many pressures come together, even a well-adapted people may find that old strengths no longer protect them in the same way. A strong body helps in cold weather, but it does not create more mates if nearby groups are too far away. Good hunting knowledge helps when animals are present, but it does not stop herds from shifting with climate. A familiar cave protects against wind, but it does not guarantee food in the surrounding land. Long experience can guide a group through many difficulties, but it cannot remove every limit. This is why we must be careful with the idea that Neanderthals were simply replaced because Homo sapiens were better in every way. That statement is too broad, too simple, and too confident. The evidence suggests difference, not a clean ladder from lower to higher. Neanderthals had their own strengths. Homo sapiens may have had advantages in some settings, especially if their groups were larger, more connected, or more flexible across wider landscapes. But an advantage does not have to look dramatic. It can be quiet. It can be a slightly wider exchange network, a slightly better chance of finding partners, a slightly faster recovery after hunger, a slightly greater ability to move into new areas when old ones became harder. Over many generations, small differences can change the future of whole populations. So the disappearance of Neanderthals becomes more serious when we respect what they were. They were not shadows waiting for modern humans to arrive. They were ancient people with bodies, tools, fires, bonds, and memories suited to a real world. Their ending, if we can call it an ending, was not the simple fall of the weak. It was the fading of a people who had survived almost everything their world had asked of them, until the questions changed. The world of the Neanderthals was not a frozen picture. It changed around them again and again, sometimes slowly enough for memory and movement to adjust, and sometimes sharply enough to turn familiar places into uncertain ground. When we imagine Ice Age Europe, it is easy to picture only endless snow, but the real landscape was more complex. There were cold open plains, wooded valleys, rocky shelters, river routes, grasslands, and patches of forest that expanded or withdrew as the climate shifted. A place that had once held animals, wood, water, and shelter could become less reliable. A route that had once led hunters toward migrating herds might lose its value when the animals moved elsewhere. A valley that had once offered protection from wind might become too dry, too empty, or too far from food. For Neanderthals, climate was not an idea in the sky. It was the ground under their feet, the animals beyond the ridge, the wood needed for fire, the skins needed for warmth, and the distance between one living group and another. This is why climate matters in the question of their disappearance, but it must be handled carefully. It is not honest to say that one cold winter killed the Neanderthals, it is not honest to say that a single climate event erased them everywhere. They had already lived through harsh conditions for a very long time. Cold itself was not new to them. What may have mattered more was instability, the repeated changing of habitats, resources, and movement patterns. If a group knows a landscape well, that knowledge is a kind of inheritance. It tells them where animals may pass, where stone can be found, where shelter is safer, where water remains, and where another group might be met. But when the landscape changes too often, that inheritance becomes less certain. Old knowledge still has value, but it may no longer be enough in the same way. A skilled hunter can read tracks, but if the herds are fewer, the skill cannot create animals. A group can maintain fire, but fire does not solve hunger if the surrounding land has changed. A family can remember a good shelter, but a shelter without nearby food becomes only stone. This does not make climate the whole answer. It makes climate a pressure that touches every other answer. If Neanderthal groups were already small, unstable conditions could make small numbers more dangerous. If groups were scattered, changing environments could make contact between them harder. If Homo sapiens were entering some of the same regions, climate stress could make competition for good places more important. If animals moved, both kinds of humans may have followed them, bringing their paths closer together or forcing them into different zones. The disappearance of the last Neanderthals may have been shaped not by climate acting alone, but by climate making every other challenge sharper. Imagine a group returning to a hunting ground known by parents and grandparents. The river is still there, but the herds are not passing in the same way. The trees are thinner. The season feels wrong. There is less wood in one place and more danger in another. They do not know they are living inside a historical transition. They are only trying to make the next decision. Move or stay. Risk a longer journey or wait. Divide the group or remain together. Search for others or protect what remains. Across one lifetime, these choices may not look like extinction. Across many generations, they can change whether a people continues. Climate can reduce abundance. Reduced abundance can lower birth survival. Lower survival can make groups smaller. Smaller groups can lose contact. Lost contact can make recovery harder after death, injury, or hunger. In this slow chain, there is no dramatic villain. There is only a world that becomes less forgiving. The Neanderthals had strength, knowledge, and experience, but their experience had been shaped by the lands they knew. When those lands changed, their old success may have become harder to repeat. This is why the climate story must begin gently. It is not the story of helpless people freezing in a single season. It is the story of capable people facing a world whose patterns would not hold still. When the environment changes, it does not only change the scenery, it changes the rules of daily survival. For Neanderthals, a colder wind or a drier valley was not simply weather. It could mean fewer plants for grazing animals, fewer animals for hunters, less wood for fire, less shelter from storms, and longer distances between one safe place and another. A landscape is like a quiet agreement between living things. Herds move where food can grow, predators follow herds, humans follow both opportunity and danger. When that agreement shifts, every life inside it must adjust. Neanderthals had survived many changing conditions before, but survival does not mean change is harmless. Each change asks for energy. Each movement carries risk. Each failed hunt makes the next decision more urgent. If the animals they depended on moved away from familiar valleys, Neanderthal groups had to decide whether to follow, wait, search elsewhere, or divide their efforts. None of these choices was simple. Following herds could lead into unknown ground. Waiting could mean hunger. Searching could expose a small group to cold, injury, or conflict with other groups using the same resources. Dividing the group could help cover more land, but it could also make each part more vulnerable. This is one way climate pressure may have worked slowly. It did not need to destroy them directly. It only had to make ordinary survival more expensive. A hunt that once took 1 day might take 3. A shelter that once stood near animal roots might become less useful. A patch of woodland that once offered fuel might shrink. A group that once met another group during seasonal movement might miss that meeting because both had changed course. Over time, these small disruptions could matter deeply. For a population that may already have been scattered, missing contact was not a small thing. It could mean fewer exchanges of information, fewer partnerships, fewer chances to find mates, fewer ways to recover after loss. The disappearance of the last Neanderthals may therefore be connected not only to food, but to the breaking of patterns that kept groups alive. Their hunting lives were tied to knowledge of place. A group knew where animals passed in certain seasons, where stone could be collected, where water remained, where wind was less severe, where a cave entrance opened toward shelter rather than exposure. This knowledge was powerful because it was specific. It belonged to real valleys, real ridges, real rivers, real animal routes. But specific knowledge can become fragile when the world that holds it begins to move. If a river changes its surrounding life, if the forest edge retreats, if open ground expands, if herds choose another path, then memory has to be tested again. The older members of a group may remember what once worked, while the younger ones learn that the old pattern no longer gives the same answer. This does not mean Neanderthals could not adapt. Their long history shows that they could. But adaptation has a cost. It takes time, numbers, and room to fail without losing too much. A larger population may absorb mistakes more easily. A wider network may pass along information from distant places. A small, isolated group may have less room for error. One difficult winter might be survived. Several unstable generations might slowly narrow the future. This is why the climate question must remain connected to the central question of disappearance. The last Neanderthals did not live inside a still museum display. They lived inside moving systems of weather, animals, plants, stone, shelter, fire, and human contact. When those systems shifted, their skills still mattered, but the tasks became harder. A strong hunter still needs animals within reach. A careful toolmaker still needs stone and time. A child still needs enough food to grow. A group still needs other groups somewhere beyond the next ridge. If the land made all of these things less reliable at once, Neanderthal life could weaken without any single dramatic event. The traces left in caves and layers of soil may show us tools and bones, but they cannot show every failed journey, every empty valley, every season when the animals came late, or every meeting between groups that never happened. Yet those quiet changes may have been part of the road toward disappearance. Not because Neanderthals did not understand their world, but because the world they understood kept becoming harder to recognize. Climate can explain pressure, but it cannot explain everything alone. This is the point we have to hold carefully before moving forward. The last Neanderthals did not disappear from a world that was merely cold. They disappeared from a world where cold, warmth, dryness, forests, open plains, animals and human movement kept changing in uneven ways. If we say climate killed them, we make the story too flat. We turn a long human disappearance into a weather report. Neanderthals had already endured difficult climates before. Their bodies, habits, shelters, tools, and hunting knowledge were all part of that long endurance. So the better question is not whether climate mattered. It almost certainly did. The better question is how climate may have made other weaknesses more dangerous. A harsh environment can press on food. Less food can press on children. Fewer surviving children can press on the future of a group. A smaller group can press on the ability to find mates, share knowledge, defend itself from hunger, and recover from death. In this way, climate is not a single hand closing around the Neanderthals. It is more like a slow tightening of many threads. One thread touches hunting, one touches travel, one touches shelter, one touches the distance between groups. One touches the chance that a child born in a hard season will live long enough to have children of their own. None of these threads alone has to end a people. Together, across time, they can change what is possible. This is why the disappearance of Neanderthals must be understood as a process rather than an event. It may have looked different from one region to another. In one place, changing vegetation may have made familiar prey less common. In another, a group may have continued for many generations, still hunting, still making tools, still lighting fires, while their wider population was already becoming more fragile. In another region, contact with Homo sapiens may have added a new pressure to an already changing world. The same large story can be made of many local stories, each slightly different, each leaving only partial evidence. When we look back now, we see the broad pattern. Neanderthal traces become rare and then disappear as a distinct population. But for the people living through that time, the change would not have felt like a single ending. It may have felt like ordinary difficulty, a hard winter, a missing herd, a child lost, a journey that failed, a neighboring group no longer seen, a shelter abandoned because the surrounding land no longer gave enough. These experiences do not sound like extinction when they happen one by one. They sound like life becoming more difficult. That is often how deep historical change enters the human world. Not as a grand announcement, but as a series of small demands that never quite stop. Climate may have made those demands heavier. Yet even here, we should not imagine Neanderthals as passive victims of weather. They moved, they adapted, they endured. Their long history proves that they could respond to change. The problem may have been that, near the end, response became harder because several pressures were acting together. Climate could disturb resources, small numbers could weaken recovery, scattered groups could lose contact, Homo sapiens could enter the same landscapes and alter the balance of survival. Interbreeding could carry some Neanderthal ancestry forward, while their separate communities disappeared. These are not separate stories placed side by side. They are connected parts of one slow human puzzle. The climate story therefore teaches us how to think about the rest of the video. It teaches us to avoid simple endings. It teaches us that survival is not only about being strong in the body or skilled with tools. Survival also depends on the stability of the world around a group, the number of people within that group, and the connections that allow life to recover after loss. A people can know their land deeply and still suffer when that land changes too often. A people can endure many winters and still be weakened by the way those winters reshape animals, plants, movement, and contact. So climate remains important, but not final. It is the background pressure against which the next question becomes sharper. If the Neanderthals were capable, and if they had survived harsh worlds before, what happens when capable people become too few? A large people can suffer a loss and still continue. A small people may suffer the same loss and feel it for generations. This is one of the quiet dangers behind the Neanderthal story. Their disappearance may not have required one overwhelming disaster. It may have required many ordinary losses happening to groups that were already small, scattered, and difficult to reconnect. When we imagine extinction, we often imagine something loud: fire, violence, disease, sudden cold, or a final collapse. But for a small population, danger can be much less dramatic. One child who does not survive, one hunter who dies before teaching what he knows, one injured mother, one group that fails to meet another group at the right season, one winter that leaves too few people to rebuild what was lost. These things do not look like the end when they happen. They look like grief, hunger, and silence around a fire. Yet over long stretches of time, they can change the future of a whole population. Neanderthals seem to have lived in relatively small and separated groups across large landscapes. This does not mean they were always alone, or that every group was cut off in the same way. But compared with a wide, dense, highly connected population, small scattered groups carry special risks. A group may know its valley well, but if there are too few people beyond the valley, recovery becomes harder. A group may have strong hunters, but if several are lost, there may not be enough skilled adults to replace them. A group may have children, but if too few children live to adulthood, the next generation becomes thinner. A group may carry knowledge, but knowledge must pass from person to person. If the chain becomes too narrow, even old knowledge can become fragile. This connects directly to the disappearance of the last Neanderthals, because a population does not vanish only when its last individual dies. It begins to vanish earlier, when its ability to renew itself weakens. Renewal is not only birth, it is also contact, exchange, learning, movement, and the ability to recover after bad years. Imagine several Neanderthal groups living across a wide region. One group has a difficult winter and loses members. Another group moves away because animal routes have shifted. A third group remains, but now the distance between them is greater. The next season, fewer people meet. Fewer partnerships are formed. Fewer stories, warnings, and practical knowledge travel across the land. No one has been defeated. No one has chosen extinction. But the human web has become thinner. For small populations, this thinning can become dangerous by itself. It can make it harder to find mates without close kinship. It can increase the risk that local accidents matter too much. It can allow random events to shape the future more strongly than they would in a larger population. A single death in a large population is a sorrow. A single death in a very small group can also be a demographic fact. It may remove a parent, a tool maker, a hunter, a memory of a route, or a connection to another family. This is a cold truth, but not a cruel one. It reminds us that survival is not only about intelligence or courage. It is also about numbers. Neanderthals may have been capable in body and mind, but capability needs enough people to continue carrying it. The land may still hold caves, the stone may still break into useful edges, the fire may still burn. But if the people around the fire become fewer, and the next group is too far away, the future becomes less secure. This is why small numbers matter so much in the Neanderthal question. They turn ordinary hardship into something heavier. They make climate stress sharper. They make competition more serious. They make recovery slower. They make chance more powerful. The disappearance of Neanderthals may have begun not as a sudden ending, but as a weakening of renewal itself. Small numbers do not always look dangerous from the outside. A small Neanderthal group could still seem strong in a single moment. There might be skilled hunters, older members with deep memory of the land, children learning by watching, fires kept alive, tools repaired, and meat shared after a successful hunt. Nothing in that scene would tell an observer that the future was fragile. But the danger of small numbers is not always visible in one evening. It is hidden in what happens after repeated strain. A group can lose one adult and continue. It can lose one child and continue. It can survive one poor season, one injury, one failed journey, one missed meeting with another group. But if losses return often, and if the wider population is thin, each loss becomes harder to absorb. This is one of the quiet ways the disappearance of Neanderthals may have unfolded. It may not have begun with a final catastrophe. It may have begun with recovery becoming slower than damage. Hunger is one danger. A group that finds less food for a season can survive by moving, sharing, taking risks, or eating whatever is available. But hunger does not strike only the stomach. It touches birth, childhood, strength, attention, and the ability to heal. A hungry hunter may take greater risks. A hungry child may grow weaker. A pregnant woman may face more danger. An injured person may recover more slowly. If food shortages happen rarely, the group may endure them. If they happen again and again, the number of surviving children may fall. Over time, fewer children means fewer adults, fewer future parents, fewer hunters, fewer tool makers, and fewer carriers of memory. Disease is another pressure, though we must speak of it carefully. We cannot look at every Neanderthal group and know what illnesses pass through it. But in any small human group, sickness can be serious because there are fewer people to care for the ill, gather food, maintain fire, and protect children while others are weak. A sickness that a larger population might absorb could leave a smaller group deeply reduced. Even if disease was not the main cause of Neanderthal disappearance, It belongs among the kinds of pressures that small populations face more dangerously than large ones. Accident also matters. In a hunting life, accident is not rare. A fall, a broken leg, a wound from an animal, an infection, a burned hand, a damaged eye, or a death during travel can change the balance of a group. Neanderthals cared for injured individuals in some cases, which shows that social support existed. But care itself requires enough people and enough food. If too many needs come at once, kindness may not be enough to protect the future. Then there is the problem of finding partners. A population can continue only if people can meet beyond their immediate group. If the groups are small and far apart, if climate shifts animal routes, if travel becomes harder, if neighboring groups disappear or move away, then the chances of forming new family bonds may shrink. This does not need to happen everywhere at once. It only needs to happen often enough, across enough regions, to weaken the larger Neanderthal presence. The danger here is not romantic loneliness. It is biological continuity. Without enough contact between groups, the future narrows. Close kin may have fewer options. New alliances become rarer. Knowledge has fewer paths to travel. A warning about a good valley, a memory of where stone can be found, a habit of meeting at a certain season, all of these can fade when groups stop crossing paths. This is why isolation can be as dangerous as hunger. It does not always kill directly. It makes everything else harder to repair. A small group that remains connected to others may recover after hardship. A small group that is cut off may survive for a while, but its future becomes more dependent on chance, and chance is cold. Chance does not care whether a people is intelligent, strong, or ancient. Chance only asks whether there are enough lives to withstand what happens next. In this sense, the last Neanderthals may have disappeared not because every group failed in the same way, but because too many groups became too thin to restore themselves. Some may have died out locally. Some may have joined with other human groups. Some may have left no trace that survived. From far away in time, these different endings blur together into one word: disappearance. But inside the lived world, it may have been 1,000 small endings, scattered across valleys, shelters, and generations, until there were no longer enough Neanderthal communities to remain visible as their own people. A population does not always disappear because something stronger strikes it down. Sometimes it disappears because its future becomes too narrow. This is one of the hardest ideas in the Neanderthal story, because it does not give us a dramatic scene to imagine. There is no need for a final attack, no need for a sudden collapse, no need for a single winter that kills everyone. A small population can fade because births do not quite replace deaths, because groups meet less often, because children become fewer, because the spaces between living communities become too wide. From the inside, this would not feel like history ending. It would feel like ordinary life under pressure. People would still wake, search for food, repair tools, tend fire, care for children, and follow the movements of animals. They would still be Neanderthals, still capable, still human, still carrying knowledge from older generations. But if the number of people slowly declined, the same life would become harder to continue. A group with many connections can lose members and still find new ties. A group with few connections may lose one person and lose a parent, a hunter, a maker, a memory, and a future at the same time. This is why small numbers are so important when we ask why the last Neanderthals disappeared. They change the meaning of every other pressure. Climate change becomes more dangerous when there are fewer people to respond. Hunger becomes more dangerous when there are fewer adults to search, hunt, and share. Injury becomes more dangerous when care takes food and time from a group that already has little to spare. Distance becomes more dangerous when the next group is not near enough to meet. Even chance becomes more dangerous. In a large population, random loss may be absorbed. In a small population, random loss can become direction. A few difficult generations may be enough to turn survival into decline. This does not mean every Neanderthal group was doomed in the same way. Some may have continued for a long time in familiar places. Some may have adapted again and again. Some may have encountered Homo sapiens and exchanged more than territory. Some may have vanished locally, without leaving bones behind. But the wider pattern could still move in one direction if enough small groups failed to renew themselves. That is a quiet kind of disappearance. It does not require every group to fall at once. It only requires the number of lasting groups to shrink below the point where a separate Neanderthal presence can continue. In this way, extinction can begin before the last person is gone. It can begin when meetings become rare, when children are too few, when knowledge has fewer paths, when the web of life grows thin enough that one more loss cannot be repaired. We should not imagine this as weakness. A small group can be brave, intelligent, loving, and skilled, and still be vulnerable to mathematics that no one inside the group can see. The people living through it would not count themselves as a declining population. They would count the next meal, the next safe place, the next fire, the next child. But time would count differently. Time would notice whether each generation was large enough to replace the one before it. Time would notice whether one valley still spoke to another through movement, partnership, and shared memory. Time would notice whether the old Neanderthal world was still connected, or whether it had become a set of lonely islands. This is the cold truth of small numbers. A people does not need to be inferior to become fragile. They only need to become too few in a world that keeps asking more of them. By the time another human population began to spread more widely through the same landscapes, the Neanderthals may already have been carrying this hidden danger. Not the danger of lacking skill, and not the danger of lacking courage, but the danger of having too little room left for loss. When another human entered the same landscape, the Neanderthal world did not become a battlefield in a single moment. It became crowded in a quieter way. The valleys, caves, river paths, hunting grounds, stone sources, and seasonal routes that had supported Neanderthal life were not empty spaces waiting for the future. They were already known, used, remembered, and returned to by people who had lived there for countless generations. Then, Homo sapiens began to move through some of those same regions. This arrival should not be imagined too simply. It was not one army crossing one border. It was not one wave replacing another in a clean line. It was the slow movement of human groups through changing lands, following animals, water, stone, shelter, and opportunity. In some places, the two kinds of humans may have been separated by time or distance. In other places, their worlds may have overlapped more closely. The important point is that, near the end of the Neanderthal story, they were no longer the only human presence in parts of the landscapes they had long known. That fact matters, but it must be handled with care. It does not prove that Homo sapiens simply killed them. It does not prove a final war. It does not prove that Neanderthals were helpless before a superior enemy. What it does show is that a world already under pressure may have gained another pressure. Another human population needing food, shelter, materials, and space. Competition does not always look like violence. It can happen through ordinary needs. Two groups may want the same hunting ground because the animals pass there. Two groups may return to the same cave because it is dry, sheltered, and near water. Two groups may collect stone from the same source because it breaks into useful edges. Two groups may follow the same river because rivers guide movement through difficult terrain. No one has to declare ownership. No one has to understand the future. The pressure is already present in the fact that the land cannot give the same thing to everyone equally in every season. If Neanderthal groups were small, and if climate had already made resources less predictable, then the presence of Homo sapiens could have changed the balance. A hunting ground used by one group may become less reliable when another group is nearby. Animals disturbed by one set of hunters may move differently. A shelter occupied at the right season may not be available to another group arriving later. A source of good stone may become a place of repeated contact, avoidance, tension, or exchange. These possibilities are difficult to see directly in the ground, because archaeology rarely records the emotion of an encounter. It gives us tools, bones, layers, dates, and traces of occupation. It does not tell us whether people watched one another from a distance, avoided one another, learned from one another, feared one another, or sometimes joined together. Still, the overlap itself changes the question. The disappearance of the last Neanderthals was not happening in isolation. It was happening while another human population was spreading through wider parts of Eurasia. For a large and well-connected population, entering new land can be a movement of expansion. For a smaller population already living there, the same movement can feel like a narrowing of options. Again, this does not need to be dramatic. A Neanderthal group might return to a place and find signs that others had been there. A band of Homo sapiens might move along a route already known by Neanderthals. Both might follow the same animals after a shift in climate. One group might choose to avoid the other. Another might meet, exchange, or interbreed. Another might never meet face to face, yet still be affected because the animals, shelters, and routes around them were now used differently. This is why the arrival of Homo sapiens is so important and so difficult. It may have added competition, but it may also have added contact. It may have reduced Neanderthal space, but it may also have allowed some Neanderthal ancestry to continue through mixing. It may have brought pressure without a clear enemy. The last Neanderthals may not have disappeared because another humankind destroyed them in a single act. They may have disappeared because a fragile world became shared with people whose numbers, networks, and movements changed what survival meant. In that shared landscape, old knowledge still mattered, but the land no longer belonged to the same human story alone. Competition is often imagined as a direct struggle, with one side pushing the other aside in a way the eye can easily understand. But in deep prehistory, competition may have been much quieter than that. It may have happened without a spoken threat, without a marked boundary, without a single fight that left a clear sign in the ground. Two human groups could live near the same valley and never meet face to face, yet still affect each other. If both followed the same herds, both depended on the same dry shelters, both searched for good stone, and both moved through the same seasonal routes, then the presence of one group changed the choices available to the other. For Neanderthals, whose numbers may already have been small in many areas, this kind of quiet competition could matter deeply. A place did not need to be taken by force to become less useful. It only needed to become less predictable, less empty, less available at the right moment. A cave occupied by another group during a cold season might force movement elsewhere. A hunting ground visited more often might yield less. Animals disturbed by repeated human activity might shift their routes. A river corridor used by more people might become a place of contact, caution, or avoidance. These small changes could spread through ordinary life. A group that once expected to find shelter might have to continue walking. A hunt that once followed familiar signs might become uncertain. A meeting with another Neanderthal group might be missed because the route had changed. Nothing in this requires the simple claim that Homo sapiens destroyed Neanderthals by violence. Violence may have happened at times, as it can happen between human groups, but the evidence does not allow us to turn the whole disappearance into one story of conquest. The more honest picture is slower. Homo sapiens may have entered some regions with different patterns of movement, perhaps wider social connections, and possibly larger networks of exchange and support. Those advantages, if they existed in certain places, did not have to look dramatic. They could have worked like a small weight, placed again and again on the same side of a scale. A wider network might help a group find food when one area failed. More contacts might make it easier to find partners, share information, or move into new places. If Neanderthal groups were smaller or more separated, then the same difficult season could hurt them more. This is where competition and population begin to join together. Competition does not act in empty space. It acts on groups already shaped by climate, distance, births, deaths, and chance. In fact, if a strong and numerous population competes with a smaller scattered one, the result may not come from one moment of superiority. It may come from recovery. One group recovers faster after hunger. One group replaces losses more easily. One group can leave a poor valley and still find relatives or allies elsewhere. The other group may be just as skilled in the hunt, just as familiar with cold, just as human in care and memory, but less able to absorb repeated pressure. This is why the disappearance of Neanderthals should not be framed as a simple contest of intelligence. A population can lose ground without being foolish. It can fade without being defeated in a clear battle. It can become rare because the surrounding world gives fewer chances to repair what is lost. The arrival of Homo sapiens may have added a new kind of pressure, precisely because it came into landscapes that Neanderthals had used for so long. Old places were no longer only old places. They became shared places. Shared places can produce exchange, learning, avoidance, tension, and interbreeding. They can also create uncertainty. The last Neanderthals may have looked out across valleys where human footsteps were no longer only their own. They may have seen smoke from another fire. They may have found tools left by unfamiliar hands. They may have avoided certain routes, or followed animals into areas where other people were already moving. We cannot know the feeling of those moments, but we can understand the pressure behind them. When a small population must share a changing world with another expanding human population, disappearance can begin as a narrowing of choices. Less room to hunt, fewer safe returns, fewer meetings with familiar groups, more need to move, more uncertainty in places that once felt known. Over many generations, this quiet competition may have helped turn a strong ancient people into a rarer one, not by proving they were lesser, but by making their already fragile future harder to restore. The arrival of Homo sapiens is one of the strongest pieces in the Neanderthal question, but it is still not the whole answer. If we make it the whole answer, we risk turning a long, uneven human story into a simple replacement tale. The evidence asks for more patience than that. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were not symbols in a myth. They were living groups, moving through real landscapes, needing food, shelter, fire, stone, partners, and safe places for children. When their worlds overlapped, the result could have been many different things in different places. There may have been avoidance. There may have been tension. There may have been curiosity. There may have been exchange. There was certainly enough closeness, in some cases, for interbreeding to leave traces in later human ancestry. That alone tells us the meeting was not always a clean separation between two untouched worlds. But contact does not mean equality of outcome. Two populations can meet, share space, and even mix, while one of them still loses its separate continuity over time. This is the difficult balance to hold. Homo sapiens may not need to be imagined as destroyers for their arrival to matter. Their presence could still have changed the conditions of survival. If modern human groups were more numerous in certain regions, or more connected across wider distances, they may have recovered from hardship more easily. They may have found partners more often. They may have moved information, materials, and habits through broader networks. They may have entered new spaces when old ones became difficult. None of this means Neanderthals were dull or helpless. It means that survival is not decided only by individual strength or skill. It is also decided by how many people carry those skills, how far those people can reach, and how quickly a group can repair itself after loss. For a Neanderthal group already facing changing climate, small numbers, and scattered contacts, the arrival of another human population could have made the balance tilt. Not in one clear moment, but again and again. A shelter used by another group, a hunting ground less reliable, a missed meeting with familiar people, a movement into poorer land, a season when fewer children survived, a contact that led to mixing rather than the continuation of a separate group. Over many generations, these small turns could become history. We should also remember that the archaeological record does not preserve every human encounter. It may preserve tools in a layer, bones in a cave, charcoal from a fire, or a tooth in sediment, but it does not preserve most glances, decisions, fears, or choices. It does not tell us whether a Neanderthal family watched strangers from a distance, whether they followed the same herd on different days, whether they shared a shelter in different seasons, or whether children born from mixed ancestry grew up inside one group rather than another. These unknowns matter because they keep the story honest. The disappearance of Neanderthals was not simply a case of one humankind walking in and the other immediately walking out. It was more likely a long period of shifting presence, shrinking options, local endings, and partial merging. Some Neanderthal groups may have remained for a time, after Homo sapiens appeared nearby. Some may have never met them directly. Some may have met them closely enough that the boundary between them and us became less sharp in the bodies of later generations. The central question, therefore, becomes more subtle. Did Neanderthals disappear because Homo sapiens arrived, or did Homo sapiens arrive into a world where Neanderthals were already vulnerable? The honest answer may be that both things belong to the same process. A small, pressured population may have been more affected by the arrival of a larger or more connected one. A changing climate may have made competition sharper. Interbreeding may have carried some Neanderthal ancestry forward, while separate Neanderthal communities became fewer. This does not give us a final sentence. It gives us a direction. The old Neanderthal world was no longer shaped only by Neanderthal movement, Neanderthal memory, and Neanderthal return. Another human story had entered the same valleys and routes. After that, survival may have depended less on who was stronger in a single encounter, and more on who was connected enough to continue. A stone tool can tell us that a hand once worked with skill, but it cannot tell us how far that hand was connected to other hands. This is an important difference when we think about Neanderthals and Homo sapiens near the end of the Neanderthal story. Both kinds of humans made tools, both used fire, both knew how to move through difficult landscapes and turn natural materials into something useful. If we stop there, the question may seem simple. Who had better tools? Who hunted better? Who thought better? Who deserved to continue? But that is not the right way to hold the evidence. Survival in deep prehistory was not decided only by the sharpness of one tool or the strength of one hunter. It was also decided by how knowledge traveled, how groups stayed in touch, how people found partners, how materials moved from one place to another, and how a population recovered when one place became difficult. A Neanderthal group could be deeply skilled in its own landscape and still face danger if its contacts were few. A Homo sapiens group could face the same cold, the same hunger, and the same uncertainty. But if it belonged to a wider web of people, then it may have had more ways to survive a bad season. This is where connection becomes a quiet power. It does not look dramatic in the ground. It does not leave a single object that says, here is the reason one population endured and another faded. Instead, it leaves patterns that researchers try to interpret carefully. Materials moved across distance, tool styles appearing across wider areas, signs that people were not only surviving locally, but linked to broader worlds of exchange and movement. We should be cautious. The evidence is not simple, and not every difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens should be turned into a ranking. Neanderthals were not people without knowledge. Their tool traditions lasted for immense periods. Their skills were real. Their lives were not empty or primitive. Yet the final period of their history may have been shaped by more than what one group knew inside one valley. It may have been shaped by how many other groups they could reach beyond that valley. Imagine two small communities facing a hard winter. Both know how to make fire. Both know how to cut meat and prepare hides. Both know the animal trails near their shelters. But one community has connections with other groups far beyond the next ridge. It may hear, through movement and meeting, where animals have gone. It may find partners from another region. It may exchange stone, tools, ornaments, or habits. It may move away from scarcity and still remain within a human network. The other community may be just as intelligent, just as skilled, just as brave, but more isolated. If the animals fail near them, they have fewer sources of information. If children are few, they have fewer chances to join with others. If a skilled toolmaker dies, there are fewer paths for that knowledge to be renewed. Over 1 year, the difference may be invisible. Over many generations, it can become enormous. This is why the disappearance of Neanderthals cannot be explained by saying they lacked ability. The more careful question is whether their social world had enough reach to carry that ability through repeated stress. Tools matter, but tools are made inside communities. Fire matters, but fire is kept by people who share labor. Hunting matters, but hunting knowledge grows stronger when it can be passed across more than one small group. Even the movement of stone matters because stone can reveal how people moved, returned, exchanged, or stayed within certain ranges. If Homo sapiens groups in some regions maintained wider networks, that could have made them more flexible when climate shifted and resources became uncertain. It would not mean Neanderthals were lesser humans. It would mean the structure around survival was different. A small, separated population can hold great knowledge and still become fragile when there are too few routes for that knowledge to travel. A wider network can act like a hidden shelter. It may not stop hunger, but it gives more directions to move. It may not prevent death, but it gives a population more ways to replace loss. It may not make one person stronger, but it can make the future of the group less narrow. Near the end of the Neanderthal story, this may have mattered as much as strength, as much as tools, and perhaps more than any single invention. The last Neanderthals may not have disappeared because their hands could not shape stone. They may have disappeared because the human web around those hands became too thin. Connection can make survival larger than the people who stand in one place. A small group may know its valley well, but a connected group may know more than one valley. It may know where the herds went when the usual route failed. It may know where good stone can be found after a riverbed runs dry. It may know which distant shelter is safe in winter, where another family group might be met, or which path crosses the hills without too much risk. These kinds of knowledge do not always leave a clear fossil. They move through voices, gestures, journeys, repeated meetings, shared habits, and the slow trust between groups. For Neanderthals, the question is not whether they had knowledge. They clearly did. The question is whether their knowledge travelled widely enough near the end, when climate, small numbers, and the presence of Homo sapiens made survival more demanding. A tool made in isolation can still be sharp. A fire kept by one family can still be warm. A hunter who knows a valley can still be skilled. But when the world becomes unstable, a narrow circle of knowledge may not be enough. In a hard season, the most important thing may not be the strength of one person, but the number of paths open to the whole group. A wider network can turn distant information into local survival. If one place fails, another place may be known. If one group loses people, another group may still offer partners, support, or shared movement. If one method becomes less useful, another way of working may arrive through contact. This is why networks matter so deeply in the disappearance of Neanderthals. They may help explain how a capable population can still become vulnerable. The issue is not a simple contest between clever Homo sapiens and incapable Neanderthals. It is more like a difference in the size and strength of the human web around them. If Homo sapiens groups in some regions had broader contact with one another, that contact may have made them more flexible. They could move information, materials, and people across longer distances. They could recover from scarcity by drawing on a larger social world. They could keep going when one local place became poor because the group was not trapped inside only one local answer. Neanderthals, by contrast, may have had strong local knowledge, but smaller or more fragmented networks in some periods and places. This would not make them less human. It would make their future more exposed to repeated loss. Imagine two groups after a failed hunt. In one group, the failure remains local. They have little news from beyond their own range. They do not know whether animals are more abundant elsewhere. They do not know whether another group nearby has found better shelter. They have fewer chances to meet new partners or share risk. In another group, the failure is serious, but it is not sealed off. A relative group may be reached. A distant route may be remembered. A material from another place may show that movement and exchange are still alive. The difference is not magic. It is connection. Over many generations, connection can soften the damage of bad luck. Isolation can make the same bad luck heavier. This links directly back to the question of why the last Neanderthals disappeared. Their ending may not have come from lacking intelligence, but from living in social worlds that were too small, too scattered, or too pressured to carry them through every change. A wide network does not prevent death. It does not stop winter. It does not guarantee food. But it gives a population more ways to answer hardship. It allows knowledge to survive even when one group weakens. It allows people to move without becoming completely lost. It allows children, partners, tools, habits, and memory to cross the spaces between shelters. Without enough connection, each group has to carry too much of the future alone. For the Neanderthals, that may have been one of the quiet dangers. They had survived by knowing their world closely, but near the end, perhaps survival required knowing a wider world than any one group could hold. A human group is more than the people who can be seen around one fire. It is also the people who might be reached beyond the next ridge, the people remembered from an old meeting place, the people who know another valley, another river, another way through danger. Near the end of the Neanderthal story, this hidden size of a population may have mattered as much as the visible size of any one group. A camp could appear alive and capable, with hunters returning, tools being repaired, children watching older hands, and firelight moving across stone. But if that camp was not strongly connected to other camps, then its future was narrower than it looked. One group can hold knowledge, but many groups can carry knowledge farther. One group can survive one season, but a network can help a population survive repeated bad seasons. This is why connection becomes one of the quietest and most powerful ideas in the question of Neanderthal disappearance. It does not replace climate, small numbers, or the arrival of Homo sapiens. It ties them together. Climate makes resources uncertain. Small numbers make recovery difficult. Another human population makes the landscape more crowded. But weak connection can make all of these pressures more dangerous, because each group has fewer ways to escape the limits of its own immediate world. If Homo sapiens groups in some regions had broader social networks, then their advantage may not have been one brilliant invention or one sudden leap of intelligence. It may have been a wider pattern of contact. Wider contact can carry useful stone across distance. It can carry news of animals, shelter, water, and safe routes. It can carry partners from outside a small family group. It can carry habits that improve slowly because many hands and many minds touch them. This kind of advantage is easy to underestimate because it is not as visible as a spear point or a bone. Yet in a difficult world, a network can become a kind of shelter, not a shelter of stone, but a shelter of options. If one place fails, another place may be known. If one group is weakened, another may still be strong. If one path closes, someone may remember a different path. Neanderthals may have had connections too, and we should not imagine them as isolated in every place or every period. That would be another false simplification. But if their groups were often small, scattered, and under pressure, then even real connections may have been too thin to protect a separate Neanderthal future everywhere. A thin network can survive during stable times. It can work when the land gives what it usually gives, when groups meet where they expect to meet, when children are born in enough numbers, and when the next valley still holds familiar people. But when the world becomes unstable, thin connections are tested. Miss one meeting, and a partnership may never form. Lose one group, and a whole route of memory may disappear. Move into poorer land, and the distance to others may become too great. Over many generations, these gaps can widen until the old social world no longer repairs itself. This gives us a different way to think about the last Neanderthals. Perhaps some of them were not living at the edge of skill, but at the edge of connection. They may have known how to hunt, how to make fire, how to shape stone, how to survive cold, and how to care for one another. Yet they may not have had enough people within reach to keep those skills flowing through time. A culture can fade even while individuals remain capable. A way of life can weaken even while a group continues to fight for each day. The disappearance of Neanderthals may therefore be partly the story of a human web losing its strength, not because every thread broke at once, but because too many threads became too few, too distant, or too hard to renew. This prepares us for the next strange turn in the story, because even if Neanderthal communities faded as separate living groups, they did not leave the human story completely untouched. The ground shows fewer of them. The record grows quiet, but later human bodies carry another kind of evidence, one that asks a deeper question. If part of Neanderthal ancestry continued inside Homo sapiens, then what exactly disappeared? The strangest part of the Neanderthal disappearance is that the ground grows quiet before the body fully leaves the human story. In caves and ancient layers, the signs of Neanderthal communities become fewer. Their bones become rare. Their tools become harder to separate from the wider changes of the time. Their presence as a distinct people fades. But in another kind of record, one hidden inside living bodies, something remains. Many people today, especially outside Africa, carry small amounts of Neanderthal ancestry. This does not mean Neanderthals are still here as they once were. It does not mean their languages, their memories, their children, their shelters, or their communities continued unchanged. But it does mean the word disappeared has to be used with care. Their separate way of life ended. Their visible communities vanished from the archaeological record. Yet some fragments of their ancestry were carried forward through encounters with Homo sapiens. This is not a simple rescue from extinction, and it is not a romantic answer to the mystery. It is a colder, stranger truth. A people can disappear as a people, while part of their biology continues inside another population. That idea changes the emotional shape of the question. When we ask why the last Neanderthals disappeared, we are not only asking why their bones stopped appearing in caves, we are asking how one human population can fade as a living community while leaving traces in the bodies of another. Genetic evidence tells us that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were close enough, in some places and times, to have children together. This does not tell us what those encounters felt like. It does not tell us whether they involved trust, fear, alliance, accident, tension, or belonging. Ancient DNA cannot preserve a conversation. It cannot tell us what a mother thought when a child was born, or how a mixed child was seen by either group. It only tells us that the boundary between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was not absolute. They were different human populations, but not so separate that no ancestry could pass between them. This matters because it prevents a false picture of the past. The last Neanderthals were not simply on one side of a wall, while modern humans stood on the other. In at least some places, the wall was crossed. Bodies carried evidence that communities may not have understood in the way we understand it now. A meeting between groups might lead to avoidance in one valley, competition in another, and children in another. The same broad period could contain many different human outcomes. For the question of disappearance, this creates a difficult balance. Interbreeding may have helped some Neanderthal ancestry survive, but it did not save Neanderthal communities as separate communities. A few strands of ancestry are not the same as a continuing people. A genetic trace does not preserve a spoken name, a remembered path, a way of teaching a child, or the particular knowledge of a Neanderthal group living in a particular landscape. So we must not use DNA to pretend that nothing was lost. Something profound was lost. The world lost a distinct form of human life, with its own long history of adaptation, movement, care, and survival. At the same time, we must not speak as if Neanderthals vanished into pure nothing. Some part of them entered the later human story, quietly, biologically, without preserving the full world from which it came. This is why the disappearance is not a clean extinction in the way we might imagine the last animal of a species dying alone. It is more complicated. Neanderthals faded as groups, but not every part of them was erased. Their ending may have included local die-outs, shrinking populations, competition, isolation, and also absorption into Homo sapiens groups. These processes can happen together. They do not cancel one another. They make the story more human and less easy to close. The last Neanderthals may have disappeared not only by dying, but also by becoming rare, by mixing, by leaving fewer children identified with their own groups, and by having some descendants carried into communities that were no longer Neanderthal. That is why this part of the story must be told slowly. DNA gives us a trace, but not a complete voice. It shows survival, but also loss. It tells us that disappearance can be partial, uneven, and deeply difficult to define. Interbreeding is one of the most difficult parts of the Neanderthal story to imagine honestly, because it invites the mind to fill the silence with scenes we cannot prove. We should not turn it into romance, and we should not turn it into violence without evidence. The safest way to begin is simpler. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were close enough, at least in some times and places, for ancestry to pass between them. That means they met not only as shapes in the distance, but as living human beings who could have children whose descendants entered later populations. This does not tell us the language of those meetings. It does not tell us whether people stayed together, separated quickly, joined groups, exchanged knowledge, or simply crossed paths during a period of movement and pressure. Ancient DNA gives us proof of biological contact, but not the full human meaning of that contact. For the question of why the last Neanderthals disappeared, this matters deeply, because interbreeding changes the idea of extinction. If a Neanderthal group becomes smaller over generations, and some of its members have children with Homo sapiens, the result may not look like a single ending. Some family lines may continue, but inside a different social world. A child with mixed ancestry may grow up among Homo sapiens, or among a group with both kinds of ancestry, or in a setting we cannot clearly name from the evidence. Over time, if there are fewer Neanderthal communities and more Homo sapiens communities, the identity of the population can shift, even while some ancestry survives. This is a quiet form of disappearance. It is not the same as every Neanderthal person dying without descendants. It is also not the same as Neanderthals continuing unchanged. It sits between those ideas, and that is why it feels strange. A people can leave descendants and still lose their separate presence in the world. We can understand this slowly by thinking about communities rather than isolated genes. A community is not only biology, it is where children learn, who teaches them, what routes they travel, what tools they see made, what foods they grow used to, what dangers they are warned about, and what older people remember. If a Neanderthal child, or a child with Neanderthal ancestry, grows up in a group whose ways are increasingly shaped by Homo sapiens, then the genetic trace may continue while the older Neanderthal social world fades. The body carries one kind of memory, the community carries another. DNA can survive when the community memory does not. This is why we should not soften the disappearance too much by saying that Neanderthals are simply still alive inside us. That would erase the loss. The camps, the familiar valleys, the particular skills of particular groups, the relationships between elders and children, the ways of returning to shelters, the sound of voices no one recorded, all of these are gone beyond recovery. A small percentage of ancestry cannot bring them back. Yet we also should not describe them as if they left nothing. That would ignore the genetic evidence. The truth is more delicate. Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct human population, but not every thread of their ancestry was cut. Some threads were woven into the expanding story of Homo sapiens. This may have happened while other pressures were already weakening. Neanderthal continuity, climate instability, small numbers, scattered groups, and competition for landscapes. Interbreeding may therefore have been one part of a wider process, not a separate answer standing alone. In one region, a group might fade because too few children survived. In another, because contact with other Neanderthal groups became rare. In another, because Homo sapiens became more numerous and more connected. In another, because mixing carried some descendants into a different population. These possibilities do not cancel one another. They can all belong to the same slow disappearance. When we speak of the last Neanderthals, then, we may not be speaking only about death. We may also be speaking about absorption, loss of community, shrinking numbers, and the fading of a separate way of being human. The most unsettling thought is that some of the last Neanderthal descendants may not have known they were living after an ending. They may simply have grown up among people, learned the tools around them, followed the routes their group followed, and carried within their bodies a past that was already becoming invisible. If a trace of Neanderthal ancestry still remains in many people today, then the word disappeared becomes less simple than it first seemed. We usually think of disappearance as absence. Something was here, and then it was gone. A fire burned, and then it went out. A voice spoke, and then there was silence. But the Neanderthal story does not fit perfectly into that shape. Their communities faded from the living world. Their bones became rare. Their tools no longer marked a clearly separate presence. Their old places stopped carrying the same signs of return. Yet some part of them moved forward, not as a visible people, not as a remembered culture, but as ancestry hidden inside later human bodies. This does not answer the question of why they disappeared. It makes the question deeper. Did the Neanderthals disappear when their last separate communities were gone? Did they disappear when their ways of life could no longer be passed from elders to children? Did they disappear when no group remained that could be called Neanderthal in the old sense? Or did they continue, in a much narrower and quieter form, through the descendants of mixed human families? There is no easy sentence that can hold all of this. Biology and community do not always end at the same time. A genetic trace can survive after a way of life has vanished. A people can leave descendants and still lose their name, their places, their memories, and their separate future. This is why the Neanderthal disappearance is not only a scientific question about bones and dates, it is also a question about what we mean when we say a people is gone. If a Neanderthal woman had a child with a Homo sapiens man, or a Neanderthal man had a child with a Homo sapiens woman, that child would not have been a theory. That child would have needed food, warmth, care, protection, and teaching. The child would have grown inside a group, learned from the people nearby, followed their movements, and inherited a world already changing. If that child's descendants became part of expanding Homo sapiens populations, then Neanderthal ancestry could continue while Neanderthal communities disappeared. This is not a clean ending, but deep time rarely gives clean endings. It gives mixtures. It gives fragments. It gives traces that survive in one form while other forms are lost forever. We have to be careful not to turn this into comfort too quickly. Saying that some Neanderthal DNA remains does not mean that the Neanderthals were saved. The living communities were not preserved. Their voices were not preserved. Their languages, if they had spoken forms of communication beyond what we can know, were not preserved for us. Their exact ways of teaching, grieving, sharing food, choosing shelter, and remembering landscapes are gone. The trace inside later humans is real, but it is small compared with the whole world that disappeared. At the same time, we should not speak as if they left no mark at all. They did. Their mark is not only in museums or cave sediments, it is also in the biological history of our species. That fact does not make them modern humans. It does not erase the difference between populations, but it does make the boundary between them and us less hard than older stories once imagined. The last Neanderthals may have disappeared as a distinct human population, while some of their ancestry passed through the very humans who lived beside them, competed with them, mixed with them, and continued after them. This is the strangest survival, not survival as a people, but survival as an echo. An echo is not the original voice. It cannot tell us the full song, but it proves that something once sounded there. So, when we ask why the last Neanderthals disappeared, we must carry two truths at once. One truth is loss. A distinct kind of human life came to an end. The other truth is continuation. Some part of that ancient life entered the long ancestry of later people. Between those two truths, the question remains open and uneasy. Perhaps disappearance is not always a door closing. Perhaps sometimes it is a shape becoming harder to see, until only its faint outline remains inside those who came after. When people hear the phrase, the last Neanderthals, the mind often searches for one place. It wants a final valley, a final cave, a final fire, a final group looking out at a world that would soon no longer know them. But the real evidence does not give us such a simple scene. The last places of the Neanderthals were not necessarily one last place. They may have been scattered edges, refuges, and late surviving pockets across different parts of Europe and Western Eurasia, each with its own timing, its own pressures, and its own uncertain record. Some regions have been discussed as possible late refuges because their landscapes may have offered shelter, varied food, or milder conditions during difficult climatic periods. Southern and western areas, including parts of the Iberian Peninsula, have often drawn attention in this discussion. But even here, we must move carefully. A place can preserve late tools, late hearths, or old layers of occupation, and still leave open the question of exactly who made them and exactly when they were there. A cave can feel like a final shelter in the imagination, but a cave is not a written testimony. It does not say, these were the last. It only holds what time allowed to remain. The idea of a last refuge is powerful because it gives shape to disappearance. It lets us imagine Neanderthals retreating farther and farther toward the margins, surviving in pockets after their presence had faded elsewhere. That may be partly true in some regions. But if we make the image too clean, we risk turning uncertain evidence into a story more certain than the ground allows. The last Neanderthals may not have known they were last. A group living near the end of their history would still have experienced life as a sequence of ordinary needs: food, warmth, children, shelter, movement, danger, and rest. They would not have seen a map showing their shrinking world. They would not have known that future people would search their caves and argue over dates. They may have lived in one region while another Neanderthal group had already vanished. They may have survived for a time after nearby groups were gone. They may have left traces that were later destroyed, buried, misread, or never found. This is why the word last becomes difficult. The last confirmed bone in one area does not necessarily mean the last living Neanderthal in the world. The last tool in one layer does not always mean the last hand that shaped such a tool. The absence of evidence from one landscape does not always mean no one was there. At the same time, we cannot use uncertainty to imagine endless survival. At some point, Neanderthals did cease to exist as separate living communities. The question is how that ending spread across space. It may have moved unevenly, like a dimming light across a wide land. One region grows quiet. Another remains active for a while. Another becomes uncertain because the evidence is too thin. Another shows signs of modern humans entering the same world. In this uneven pattern, there is no single final stage on which the whole story ends. There are many local endings, many possible overlaps, and many gaps. For the central question of why they disappeared, this matters greatly. If there was not one last place, then there may not have been one last cause. A group in a cold northern region may have faced one set of problems. A group near a southern refuge may have faced another. Some may have struggled with shrinking numbers. Some may have met Homo sapiens more often. Some may have been cut off from other Neanderthal groups. Some may have mixed into expanding modern human populations. The larger disappearance may therefore have been built from different local histories, each contributing to the same broad result. This is why we should not picture the last Neanderthals as one lonely tribe at the edge of the world. It is more honest to picture a fading pattern. Scattered fires, some already cold, some still burning, some never preserved at all. The record does not give us a final camp. It gives us a question spread across many places. The deeper we move toward the last Neanderthals, the more important uncertainty becomes. This uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is part of the honesty of science. The end of a human population that lived tens of thousands of years before writing cannot be measured like the closing of a door. Archaeologists work with what survived: bones, teeth, stone tools, charcoal, sediment, animal remains, and the position of one layer above another. Each clue matters, but each clue also has limits. A bone can be dated, but the date may come with a range. A stone tool can resemble a known tradition, but a tool does not always prove the identity of the hand that made it. A cave layer can hold signs of occupation, but layers can be disturbed, contaminated, or mixed by natural processes, animals, water, later human activity, or the long movement of sediment. The final Neanderthal presence in one region may therefore be easier to debate than to declare. This is why we should be careful with confident phrases like, "the very last Neanderthal lived here." Such a sentence sounds powerful, but the evidence often cannot support it with that kind of precision. A site may show late Neanderthal remains, or tools associated with Neanderthal occupation, or signs that have been interpreted in that direction. But as dating methods improve, some once late dates become older. Some samples that once seemed to belong near the final edge of Neanderthal history may be revised after better cleaning, better testing, or better understanding of contamination. This does not mean earlier researchers were careless. It means the past is difficult to separate from the materials that hold it. Ancient bone absorbs things. Charcoal can move. Sediment can shift. A sample can carry younger carbon, older carbon, or an unclear relationship to the human activity being studied. Even when the method is strong, the result still has to be placed back into the story of the site. Was the dated object truly made or used by Neanderthals? Was it in its original layer? Does it belong to the same moment as the tools nearby? These questions may sound small, but they shape the entire map of disappearance. If one date changes by a few thousand years, a supposed late refuge can become less certain. If one tool tradition is reassessed, the identity of a group at a site can become harder to define. If one layer is found to be disturbed, the story built on it must slow down. For a sleep audio story, this may seem like a quiet detail, but it is one of the most important parts of staying truthful. The last Neanderthals cannot be found by imagination. They must be approached through evidence that is incomplete, careful, and sometimes revised. This is also why the disappearance seems to happen at different speeds in different places. The archaeological record is not equally rich everywhere. Some regions preserve bones better than others. Some caves were used repeatedly. Some open-air sites lost nearly everything. Some groups may have lived where no trace survived at all. When we say Neanderthal evidence ends in a region, we are speaking about the evidence we have, not about a perfect record of every person who lived. Absence in the ground is meaningful, but it is not always simple. It may reflect real disappearance. It may reflect poor preservation. It may reflect sites not yet found. It may reflect traces too faint to identify. And yet, despite these uncertainties, the larger pattern remains. Neanderthals do fade from the record as a distinct population. The uncertainty is not whether they are still living somewhere, hidden in the past. They are not. The uncertainty is how the ending unfolded, where the final groups survived, and how long different regions held them. This careful uncertainty protects the story from becoming false. It reminds us that the last Neanderthals were not a single dramatic image, but a difficult boundary between presence and absence. Somewhere, the final communities did live. Somewhere, the last children with a Neanderthal way of life did grow, move, learn, and sleep near fire. But the ground has not given us their names, their exact place, or their final day. It gives us fragments, and from those fragments we must speak softly. The phrase, "the last Neanderthals," may be one of the most misleading phrases in the whole story, because it makes us imagine a single ending where there may have been many. A final group in one region may not have been the final group somewhere else. A cave that gives us a late date may not be the last cave ever used. A valley that preserves no more Neanderthal bones may have lost them through time, water, animals, or chance. The true last people may have lived in a place that left no clear trace at all. This is why the end of the Neanderthals should be pictured less like a candle blown out and more like many small fires fading across a wide, dark land. Some fires disappear early, some burn longer, some leave ashes that can still be found. Some leave nothing visible, even though they were once real. Across Europe and Western Eurasia, the end was probably uneven. In one region, Neanderthal presence may have faded as climate changed and resources shifted. In another, small population size may have made recovery difficult. In another, contact with Homo sapiens may have been more direct. In another, interbreeding may have carried some ancestry forward, while separate Neanderthal communities became less common. These possibilities do not need to compete, as if only one can be true. They may be different local expressions of the same larger process. This is what makes the question so hard and also so human. No one living through those final generations would have experienced the extinction of the Neanderthals. They would have experienced hunger, movement, shelter, children, meetings, absences, and choices. A group might leave a place because the animals no longer came. Another might remain in a familiar shelter because moving was too risky. Another might meet Homo sapiens and change in ways that cannot be seen clearly in stone or bone. Another might disappear from the record simply because its last traces were never preserved. When modern people look backward, we gather these local silences and give them one name: disappearance. But the people themselves may have known only the next season. This is why the last Neanderthals should not be treated as a single lost tribe standing at the edge of time. It is more truthful to think of many small endings, some biological, some social, some cultural, some archaeological. A biological ending might mean a group left no descendants. A social ending might mean a group no longer had enough people to remain separate. A cultural ending might mean the old ways of teaching, moving, and making tools no longer passed forward as they once had. An archaeological ending might simply mean the ground stops preserving evidence we can identify. These endings are related, but they are not identical. A people can disappear from the archaeological record before every descendant is gone. A genetic trace can continue after a community has vanished. A tool tradition can fade while some people of that ancestry live on inside another group. This layered ending is harder to tell, but it is more honest than a simple final scene. It also prepares us for the larger conclusion of the video. The disappearance of Neanderthals cannot be understood by searching for one place, one moment, or one cause. The final groups may have lived under different pressures in different landscapes. Some may have been isolated. Some may have been close to Homo sapiens. Some may have been weakened by climate and small numbers, long before direct contact mattered. Some may have been absorbed into expanding human groups. The broad result was the same. After a certain point, Neanderthals no longer continued as a distinct human population, but the roads toward that result may have been many. This is why the silence they left behind feels so wide. It is not the silence of one abandoned cave. It is the silence of many places where the evidence thins, the names are unknown, and the final day cannot be found. Somewhere there was a last Neanderthal community. Somewhere there was a last child raised fully inside that world. Somewhere there was a last fire that belonged to them in the old sense. But we do not know where. We do not know when. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of the truth. Their ending was not a single point we can hold in the hand. It was a fading edge, spread across land, time, memory, and ancestry. By this point in the Neanderthal story, the answer should feel heavier than one sentence. Climate mattered, but climate alone is not enough. Small numbers mattered, but small numbers alone do not explain every region. The arrival of Homo sapiens mattered, but it should not be turned into a simple tale of conquest. Social networks mattered, but they are difficult to see clearly in stone and bone. Interbreeding mattered, but it did not preserve Neanderthal communities as they once were. Possible disease, injury, hunger, and chance may have mattered too, but none of them can be named as the single key that unlocks the whole disappearance. The honest answer is not one cause. It is a chain of causes, and perhaps not the same chain everywhere. A Neanderthal group in one valley may have faced changing animal routes and fewer neighbouring groups. Another may have lived near Homo sapiens and felt competition more directly. Another may have continued for a time in a shelter that still offered food and protection, even while wider Neanderthal populations were weakening. Another may have mixed with Homo sapiens, leaving descendants whose children no longer belong to a clearly Neanderthal community. These are not separate explanations, fighting for the truth. They are parts of a wider human ending. The disappearance of Neanderthals may have happened because many pressures became powerful together. Climate could make the land less predictable. Less predictable land could reduce food. Reduced food could lower survival, especially for children. Fewer children could make groups smaller. Smaller groups could make partner choice harder and increase isolation. Isolation could weaken the flow of knowledge and support between communities. Weaker communities could recover less easily after injury, disease, hunger, or death. At the same time, Homo sapiens entering the same landscapes could add new pressure on hunting grounds, shelters, stone sources, and movement routes. If Homo sapiens groups had broader networks in some regions, they may have had more ways to recover from the same difficulties. And if Neanderthals and Homo sapiens sometimes had children together, then some Neanderthal ancestry could continue even while Neanderthal identity as a separate population faded. This is not a clean story, but it is a more truthful one. Deep human history often works through accumulation. One hard season does not end a people. One missed meeting does not end a people. One lost child, one dangerous hunt, one shrinking forest, one unfamiliar group in a valley, one broken connection between camps. None of these alone has to be final. But repeated across many generations and spread across many places, small changes can become a major disappearance. This is the quiet mathematics of survival. A population does not need to be destroyed all at once. It only needs to lose the ability to renew itself faster than the world wears it down. That idea allows us to respect the Neanderthals without making their disappearance mysterious in a false way. They were capable people. They adapted for a very long time. They made tools, used fire, hunted, cared, learned, moved, and endured. But being capable does not remove the limits of biology, population, climate, and contact. A skilled group can still be too small. A strong body can still live in a shrinking world. A wise elder can still fail to pass knowledge forward if there are too few children or too few meetings with others. A community can still fade if every recovery becomes harder than the loss before it. This is why no single answer is honest enough. The last Neanderthals did not disappear because one simple weakness was exposed. They disappeared, most likely, because several ordinary forces became extraordinary together. The cold was not just cold. It changed food and movement. Competition was not just conflict. It changed access and choice. Small population was not just a number. It changed the meaning of every death and every birth. Interbreeding was not just survival. It was also the loss of separate continuity. When these forces are placed together, the disappearance becomes less like a sudden fall and more like a long, narrowing passage. At the beginning, many paths still existed. By the end, fewer paths remained. Somewhere in that narrowing, the Neanderthal world stopped renewing itself as its own world. One of the easiest stories to tell is that Homo sapiens arrived and killed the Neanderthals. It is direct. It has a clear actor, a clear victim, and a clear ending. But easy stories are not always honest stories. The evidence does not allow us to reduce the disappearance of Neanderthals to one simple act of destruction. This does not mean violence never happened. Human groups, ancient or modern, can come into conflict over food, shelter, territory, fear, or misunderstanding. It would be unrealistic to imagine every meeting between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens as peaceful. But it would also be misleading to turn possible moments of conflict into the main explanation for the entire disappearance of a human population spread across different regions and many generations. The archaeological record does not show a single war that erased them. It does not show one clear line of conquest moving across Europe. It does not give us the bodies of a final defeated people lying everywhere beneath the arrival of Homo sapiens. What it gives us is slower and more difficult. Overlapping dates, changing tools, thinning evidence, shifting climates, small populations, and genetic traces of interbreeding. These clues point toward pressure, contact, and replacement in a broad sense, but not toward one simple story of massacre. To say Homo sapiens killed the Neanderthals may satisfy the mind for a moment, but it closes the question too quickly. It ignores how populations actually fade. A people can disappear because their children become fewer. A people can disappear because their groups become isolated. A people can disappear because they lose access to familiar resources. A people can disappear because another population uses the same land more successfully, not through constant violence, but through better recovery, wider contact, or greater numbers. A people can disappear because some of their descendants are absorbed into another population, so that ancestry continues while a separate community does not. None of these paths requires a dramatic final battle. They require time. They require pressure. They require a world where every difficult season leaves less room to recover. Homo sapiens may have mattered greatly in this process, but the way they mattered may have been quieter than conquest. Their arrival could have changed the balance of land use. It could have increased competition for animals and shelters. It could have introduced new contacts, new diseases perhaps, though that remains difficult to prove clearly, new patterns of movement, and new possibilities for interbreeding. Their groups may have had broader social networks in some regions, allowing them to exchange information, partners, and materials over longer distances. If so, their advantage may not have been that every individual Homo sapiens was stronger or wiser than every Neanderthal. It may have been that their population system was more resilient. A resilient population can survive losses that would weaken a smaller, more fragmented one. This is an important difference. We should not confuse survival with moral worth, or disappearance with failure. The Neanderthals did not vanish because they were unworthy of the world. They had lived in that world for an immense length of time. They knew cold, hunger, stone, fire, animals, wounds, and care. Their disappearance was not a judgment placed upon them by nature. It was a historical and biological outcome shaped by many forces. A smaller population facing unstable climate may have been vulnerable before Homo sapiens became a serious presence in some places. Then, when another human population entered the same landscapes, that vulnerability may have deepened. This is different from saying Homo sapiens alone caused the end. It is more like saying that Homo sapiens arrived into an already fragile equation and changed its result. The last Neanderthals may have faced a world where fewer paths remained open, fewer neighboring groups, less reliable prey, greater distance between safe places, more competition for the best shelters and routes. More contact with humans who were similar enough to interbreed, but numerous or connected enough to carry the future in another direction. In such a world, disappearance could happen without a single crime large enough to explain it. It could happen through gradual imbalance. One population grows, spreads, connects, and absorbs. Another shrinks, fragments, mixes, and fades. That may be less dramatic than the story of a final war, but it is more truthful to the evidence, and it leaves us with a deeper question. Not who struck the final blow, but how many quiet pressures can gather before a people can no longer remain themselves. The disappearance of the Neanderthals becomes clearer when we stop looking for a single final blow. It was not necessarily a murder mystery with one culprit hidden in the ancient dark. It was more like a long change in the conditions that allowed a people to remain themselves. Climate shifted the land, animal routes changed, food became less predictable in some places. Neanderthal groups may already have been small and scattered. Contact between groups may have weakened. Homo sapiens entered parts of the same landscapes. Competition may have grown around shelters, stone, prey, and movement routes. Some Neanderthals may have had children with Homo sapiens, carrying ancestry forward while separate Neanderthal communities became harder to sustain. Each of these forces matters, but none of them needs to stand alone. The deeper answer lies in how they could have worked together. A cold season is survivable if the group is large enough, connected enough, and able to move toward better resources. A A small population can continue if the land is stable, if children survive, if neighboring groups remain within reach, and if there is enough time to recover after loss. Competition with another human population can be endured if numbers are strong, routes are open, and food remains reliable. Interbreeding can carry ancestry forward, but it can also blur the future of a small population if more and more descendants grow inside another expanding human world. The problem comes when these pressures gather at once. Then the same event has a different weight. A failed hunt is not just a failed hunt. It is less food for children in a group that may already be small. A missed meeting is not just a missed meeting. It is one fewer chance for partnership, knowledge, and renewal. A shelter used by another group is not just an inconvenience. It may force movement into poorer land at the wrong season. A child with mixed ancestry is not just a sign of contact. In a changing population balance, it may also be part of a future where Neanderthal ancestry survives, but Neanderthal communities do not. This is why the disappearance was probably not a single event with one emotional shape. It may have been different in every place. In one valley, it may have looked like hunger. In another, distance. In another, contact. In another, silence after a group failed to return. In another, children growing into a world where the old Neanderthal identity no longer remained separate. From far away, we call all of this disappearance. But inside time, it may have been many ordinary pressures repeated until the old pattern could not renew itself. That is the most honest way to approach the final part of the story. Neanderthals did not have to be less human to vanish. They did not have to be foolish. They did not have to lose a single great war. They only had to face a world where their numbers, networks, resources, and separate continuity became too fragile at the same time. This makes their disappearance less dramatic, but more serious. It also makes it more useful to us, because it shows that survival is not only a matter of strength. A strong people can become vulnerable if the systems around them weaken. A skilled people can fade if there are too few children to carry skill forward. A well-adapted people can suffer when the world changes the terms of adaptation. A people can even leave descendants and still lose the living shape of their own world. The Neanderthal ending was therefore not just biological and not just archaeological. It was the slow crossing of a boundary between presence and memory. The ground kept fewer traces. The living communities became fewer. The old networks thinned. Some ancestry passed into Homo sapiens. And somewhere, without a written record, without a final witness, without a name preserved for us, the last separate Neanderthal way of life came to an end. Not because one answer explains everything, but because many answers, moving together, may have left no path wide enough for them to continue as they had been. To look back at the Neanderthals only as a people who disappeared is to see them from the wrong end of the story. Their ending matters, but it is not the whole of who they were. Long before their traces faded from caves and ancient layers, they had lived, adapted, learned, suffered, cared, moved, and endured across a span of time so large that it is difficult for the human mind to hold. They were not a mistake waiting to be corrected by Homo sapiens. They were not a rough draft of us. They were a real form of human life, shaped by cold landscapes, changing climates, hard movement, strong bodies, useful tools, firelight, memory, and the quiet labour of staying alive. When we ask why the last Neanderthals disappeared, we should not begin by treating them as failures. We should begin by recognizing how long they succeeded. They knew worlds we can only reconstruct from fragments. They knew the weight of stone in the hand before it became a cutting edge. They knew the smell of animal hide, the danger of close hunting, the need to keep fire alive, the sound of weather at the mouth of a shelter, and the importance of returning to places that had helped earlier generations survive. Their lives were not simple because they were ancient. Ancient life can be deeply complex, even when it leaves behind few objects. A person does not need writing to have memory. A group does not need cities to have care. A people does not need monuments to have meaning. Neanderthals lived in ways that were fitted to their own time, and for many thousands of generations those ways were enough. This makes their disappearance more sobering. It reminds us that survival is not the same as superiority, and disappearance is not the same as worthlessness. A population can be strong and still vulnerable. It can be skilled and still be pressed by climate, numbers, isolation, competition, and chance. It can know its world deeply and still suffer when that world changes too often. The Neanderthals were not pushed out of history because they lacked humanity. They were human, but their particular human world became harder and harder to renew. This is the lesson that should stay with the listener as the story moves toward its close. The end of the Neanderthals was not simply the end of bodies. It was the end of camps returning to the same shelters, the end of children learning a particular way of reading the land, the end of voices that belonged to a human population no longer living as itself. Even if some ancestry survived through mixing with Homo sapiens, the communities that carried the full Neanderthal way of life did not continue. That loss deserves more than a shallow explanation. It deserves patience. It deserves the humility to say that the past is not here to satisfy our need for simple answers. It is here in fragments, asking us to listen carefully. When we see Neanderthals as failed humans, we make the story smaller. When we see them as capable humans who lived for an immense time and then faded under several pressures, the story becomes larger and more useful. It teaches us that human survival has always depended on more than intelligence alone. It depends on climate, food, children, movement, connection, health, timing, and luck. It depends on whether knowledge can pass from one generation to the next. It depends on whether a group can recover after loss. It depends on whether the surrounding world still supports the old answers. The last Neanderthals may have carried answers that had worked for a very long time. They may have known how to hunt, how to shelter, how to make fire, how to shape tools, how to care for one another, and how to endure cold. But at the end, endurance may no longer have been enough. That does not make them lesser. It makes their story deeply human. A people can be real, capable, and worthy of memory, even if the future does not remain open for them. The disappearance of the Neanderthals teaches something larger than the fate of one ancient human population. It teaches that survival is never carried by strength alone. Strength matters, intelligence matters, skill matters, but none of them stands by itself. A strong body still needs food. A sharp mind still needs other minds. A skilled hand still needs children who will learn from it. A good shelter still needs a surrounding land that can support life. A people can have courage, memory, tools, fire, and care, and still become vulnerable if the world around them changes in too many ways at once. This may be the most useful lesson the Neanderthal story can offer without turning into a false moral. They were not punished by nature. They were not removed because they were unworthy. They were a successful human population whose future slowly narrowed when climate, small numbers, isolation, competition, and chance pressed together. For anyone listening in the quiet of night, this lesson is gentle but serious. Life continues not because one being is perfect, but because many conditions hold long enough for the next generation to arrive. The Neanderthals remind us that every living community depends on relationships that are easy to overlook. Relationship with land, relationship with food, relationship with weather, relationship with other groups, relationship between adults and children, relationship between memory and change. When those relationships remain strong, life can recover after hardship. When they weaken together, even capable life can fade. This is not only a prehistoric lesson, it is a human lesson. And we often want history to tell us that the strongest always survive, or that the most intelligent always inherit the future. But deep time is less simple. Sometimes the future belongs to those with wider connections. Sometimes it belongs to those with more children surviving. Sometimes it belongs to those who happen to be in the right place when the climate shifts. Sometimes it belongs to those who can move, mix, learn, and recover after loss. And sometimes a people who has lived well for a very long time still reaches a point where the old way can no longer continue. The educational value of the Neanderthal story is not fear, it is humility. It asks us to be careful with the word superior. Homo sapiens survived, but survival does not automatically mean moral superiority. Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population, but disappearance does not mean they were meaningless. They were part of the human family, not in a poetic sense only, but in a biological and historical sense. They shared enough with us to meet, to overlap, and in some cases to leave descendants. They differed enough from us to represent another human way of being, one that is now gone. Holding both facts at once helps us avoid arrogance. We can respect the fact that Homo sapiens continued without turning Neanderthals into a failed branch. We can acknowledge that modern humans may have had advantages in numbers, networks, flexibility, or timing, without pretending that the vanished population lacked humanity. This matters because the way we speak about the past shapes how we think about life itself. If we describe every disappearance as the defeat of the weak, we misunderstand the fragility of all living systems. If we describe every survivor as naturally better, we forget the role of circumstance. The Neanderthal story asks for a slower kind of understanding. It shows that a people can disappear through many small pressures, not because they were simple, but because life is complex. It shows that connection can be as important as strength. It shows that small populations can carry deep knowledge and still be at risk. It shows that extinction is not always a clean disappearance into nothing, especially when ancestry crosses from one population into another. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that every trace matters. A tooth in a cave, a tool in a layer, a fragment of DNA in a living person. Each one says that these people were real. They breathed in cold air. They carried children. They watched fires. They moved through landscapes they knew and endured for far longer than our own recorded history has existed. Their disappearance should not make us look down on them. It should make us listen more carefully to the quiet conditions that allow any human story to continue. At the end of the Neanderthal story, there is no final door for us to close. There is only a long quiet, and many traces that do not speak in a single voice. A bone in a cave tells us that someone lived. A stone edge tells us that someone worked. A hearth tells us that fire once held back the dark. A fragment of DNA tells us that not every thread was cut. But none of these traces gives us the final evening. None gives us the last child, the last shelter, the last journey, or the last time one Neanderthal voice answered another in the cold air. This is why the disappearance of the last Neanderthals remains so powerful. It is not only a mystery about what happened to them, it is a mirror held up to the fragile conditions that allow any human world to continue. We have followed many possible pressures: climate that changed the land, animals that may have moved away from familiar routes, small populations that may have struggled to recover after loss, scattered groups that may have found it harder to meet, Homo sapiens entering the same landscapes, wider networks that may have helped one population endure, and interbreeding that carried some Neanderthal ancestry forward while their separate communities faded. None of these explanations stands alone as the whole truth. Together, they form a slower and more honest picture. Neanderthals did not simply fail. They did not simply vanish in one winter. They did not simply lose one final contest. Their world appears to have narrowed over time until the old way of continuing could no longer renew itself. That is a different kind of ending. It is quieter than a battle, but perhaps more haunting. It means the last Neanderthals may have lived ordinary days inside an extraordinary historical change. They may have watched weather shift across familiar land. They may have followed herds that no longer moved as expected. They may have repaired tools beside fires without knowing that fewer fires like theirs still burned elsewhere. They may have met other humans, avoided them, competed with them, or had children whose descendants would belong to a different future. They may have carried memories of places that later held no trace of them at all. And because they left no writing, We cannot ask them what they believed was happening. We can only listen to what remains and avoid making the silence say more than it can. The value of this story is not that it gives us a perfect answer. Its value is that it teaches us how to live with an honest question. The past does not always become clearer when we force it into simple shapes. Sometimes it becomes more meaningful when we let its uncertainty remain. The Neanderthals were close enough to us to feel familiar, and different enough to remind us that humanity was once broader than the world we know now. Their disappearance tells us that being human has never been one single road. There were other roads, other bodies, other ways of knowing: cold, stone, hunger, care, and fire. One of those roads ended as a living path, yet did not disappear without leaving a mark. Somewhere in many modern bodies, a faint biological echo remains. Somewhere in the ground, their tools and bones still wait for careful hands to study them. Somewhere in the human imagination, their absence continues to ask for respect. So perhaps the right ending is not to say that we know exactly why the last Neanderthals disappeared. The right ending is to say that they were real, they endured, they changed the human story, and their fading reminds us that survival is never guaranteed by strength alone. It depends on land, time, connection, children, memory, and chance. It depends on whether a world can keep making room for a people to continue. And when we look at the quiet trace they left behind, still partly present and yet forever gone, the final question remains open. If something of the Neanderthals still lives within us, where does disappearance truly begin, and where does it truly end?